Khalid Koser is one of the world's leading migration experts. He's a colleague of ours at the Lowy Institute as a visiting fellow. He is a UK national, and to us that adds a lot of value because it means Khalid doesn't have any skin in the political game in Australia. He knows the Australian immigration debate very well, but he's not an Australian national. He doesn't live here, and he doesn't have any skin in the game. He looks at the issue objectively. And I'm particularly grateful that he could speak today because Khalid has specifically travelled to Australia from New Zealand on the way back to Geneva to speak to us today. So I'm very grateful to you for doing that. Khalid is, as well as being a visiting fellow at the Lowy Institute, he's the academic dean at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy, and then he has a string of intimidating adjunct positions. He's a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, he's an associate fellow at Chatham House, a research associate at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. He's chair of Britain's Independent Advisory Group on Country Information, and he's the editor of the Journal of Refugee Studies. All of which is to say he is a very serious global expert on migration, and it's a real honour to have him turning his mind today to Australia's problems with illegal immigration. He's going to tell us how we can stop the boats. Thank you.
Well, let me start by thanking Michael for that very kind introduction. And can I also thank the Lowy Institute for their hospitality and for extending my relationship with the Institute. It's one that I value very greatly indeed. As Michael indicated, I arrived in this part of the world relatively recently, Saturday morning, as it happens. And since I've been here, I've been reading some fairly gloomy headlines. Asylum in Australia is out of control. The government has run out of ideas. There's a political impasse and we can't work out how to get beyond it. The states are increasingly frustrated and angry with the federal government in Australia. And all of this, of course, while conditions for asylum seekers detained on Christmas Island and on the mainland are deteriorating significantly. Now, I don't want to underestimate any of those challenges, and especially not the last one, the conditions of people in detention. And I'm also not unaware of the particularities of the Australian debate around immigration. I think there's a particular historical resonance around the immigration debate in Australia that perhaps we don't see in many other parts of the world. I'm aware of the political toxicity of the asylum debate, and especially the debate around unauthorised boat arrivals. And I think I'm also aware of the policy challenges that the specific and particular geography of Australia lends itself to. To an extent, but I think I'd argue only to an extent, that makes it quite hard to compare Australia with other regions in the world, including Europe. And I'm going to an extent, make that comparison, but I certainly will bear in mind the reservations and the particularities around Australia. Even if the comparison is difficult, allow me at least to begin this presentation by giving you some perspective. This afternoon at about 5 o'clock, I'll be flying back to Europe, and there are ill winds blowing in Europe. And you'll be aware that I'm not just talking about the climate at the moment, at least the physical climate. Let's just look for a moment at Europe. Europe, 250,000 asylum seekers each year arriving in Europe still. Well over 1 million people living and working in an irregular status in Europe today as we speak. 65,000 people arrived by boat in 60 days this summer on the island of Lampedusa, fleeing the effects of the Arab Spring. Europe, a place where public confidence in the ability of governments to manage migration has drained to an absolute zero in many countries, and Europe, a place where we have a rapidly shrinking space for objective debate on migration and immigration and asylum. Europe, a place that is still, I think, facing the consequences of the Arab Spring, the very real risk, in my opinion, of the Iraqization of Libya that may well create many more migrants and refugees from that part of the world, the ongoing crisis in Syria, the continuing insecurity about what's going to happen in Egypt as well. And all of this, of course, on top of the fact that the Arab Spring, I think, has given way to a European autumn. The debt crisis, austerity, political turmoil, government changes, downgrading of sovereign bond ratings in Greece, in Ireland, in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal. Against that backdrop, against the chaos in the migration system, against the very difficult economic turmoil that we're facing and political turmoil in Europe, it seems to me that Europeans, and to an extent other people in the world as well, are at best perplexed and at worst quite frustrated by what they see taking place in Australia today. I think they are amazed that Australia has reached almost an hysterical fever pitch over still a relatively small number of people. Around 4,000 people we know arrived by boat during 2011. I think there's a frustration that Australia is allowing party politics to stand in the way of finding a solution to a humanitarian crisis. That seems to me to be untenable and quite strange to people outside Australia. I think many people find it very odd that Australia, despite being the power clearly in this region, hasn't been able to exert influence, to exert its policy solutions upon some of its neighbours, particularly to the north in the Asian region. It's incredible to many observers from the outside world, which is of course what I am, that Australia hasn't managed to come up with a firm, fair and fast processing system to move asylum seekers through the system quickly rather than leaving them in detention. These things shouldn't be beyond the capacity of a government like Australia. A government that is still quite robust, an economy that is still quite robust, relatively small numbers of people. Again, compared to Europe, I think things are fairly positive still in Australia. And let me also add that there is no doubt in my mind that the Australian managed migration system is the best in the world, bar none. So I think there's a frustration that Australia seems to have been caught up in this political turmoil over what I think is still a relatively small issue. My first message then, I suppose, this morning or this afternoon is that in my opinion Australia is not facing an asylum crisis. And in my opinion the problems, the challenges that you face in Australia around the boat arrivals and around asylum seekers must be surmountable. They cannot be insurmountable. They cannot be beyond the capacity of the Australian government to deal with this relatively small issue. That's the perspective that I'd like to provide before going into, if I may, some detail. What I'd like to do, again, relatively briefly, perhaps 20-25 minutes, no more, is cover three areas that I thought would be interesting to discuss with you. Firstly, I do want to spend a bit of time discussing why I think the boats matter, why it's important that we try to find a way to stop the boats. The headline here is that it's not just about numbers, and I'll expand upon that when I get to that section. Secondly, I want to provide what I think is perhaps a critical perspective on the so-called Malaysia Deal. It seems to me that the government has put many eggs in one basket trying to back the Malaysia Deal. I think that there's still a certain weddedness to that deal amongst certain people in the government. I think that's a mistake, and I'll explain why I think that's a mistake. And then finally, I'd like to lay out for you a few policy options, to an extent learning from the experiences of Europe, but also more broadly bringing together my experience and expertise from other parts of the world as well. So let me start then by perhaps reminding you, perhaps discussing with you, why I think these boats matter and why it's important that the issue is addressed quickly. Clearly, we can't ignore the numbers, and clearly we can't ignore what the numbers tell us about policy. I think we can discuss very clearly that relationship between policy and policy failings and increasing numbers. It's a very hard conclusion, I think, for anybody to avoid any longer. We know the numbers. When I last looked in 2011, 65 boats have arrived, carrying 4,187 people, 7 boats in just 9 days by the end of last week. November, a record month for boat arrivals since 2007, when the current government came into power, and forecasts, including from the government itself, of at least 600 arrivals per month for at least the next 6 months from now. Great, and I think justifiable concern that Afghanistan, which of course is the source for many of these people, ethnically if not geographically, they may be fleeing Pakistan and Iran instead of Afghanistan, but great concerns that Afghanistan will continue to flare up in terms of violence, will become increasingly insecure, that the Taliban is simply waiting for the US withdrawal before sectarian killings start again. The numbers do matter. The relationship between the numbers and the policies are pretty hard to avoid, and let's come back perhaps and discuss that link during discussion after my presentation. I think a more pressing reason why this matters is the one that Michael touched upon, which is the humanitarian issue. As you said, Michael, the 15th of December, just under a year ago today, that Civ 221 went down, at least 50 deaths. We don't know how many other people die undertaking this journey. whether it's from Iran via Indonesia, then on a boat. They may not die perhaps on the boats, but they may find themselves in trouble or vulnerable or dying during the journey, the first leg of the journey, or during their transit period in Indonesia, for example. I've seen government estimates that 4% of people who set off on this journey don't make it. So Civ 221 was the headline, but we think there are many other people suffering and perhaps dying during this journey. This, it seems to me, is a humanitarian issue. And I think if we can achieve that agreement, if we can achieve consensus around that conclusion, then that should open the way for some more constructive policy making. And I'd like to come back to that conclusion towards the end. There's a third reason why I think it matters. And I think the third reason why it matters is because this fiasco, this ongoing debate, this ongoing impasse over, again, what I consider to be a relatively small number of people, I think is doing damage, and potentially lasting damage, to the policy landscape, to the policy-making arena. And I think once you've damaged the policy-making arena, it's quite hard to recover it and to rebuild it. Let me tell you what I mean. It's quite clear that boat arrivals have become a source of real political rancor and real division between the main political parties. That is quite clear, and we've seen that at the moment in Australia. The boats have, I think, strained somewhere towards breaking point the relationship between the executive and the judiciary. I don't think that's a very healthy situation to be in when you're trying to think about making policy. It has poisoned relationships between government and civil society. Far from being consulted and involved in some sort of collaborative effort, there seems to be a real opposition between these two parts in the debate at the moment. And perhaps of most concern to me, and I have spoken about Europe already, I think there's a draining of public confidence in Australia as well over the ability of the Australian government to manage its borders. And we've seen in many other policy arenas and in many other parts of the world that once you lose public confidence in your policy making, it's very hard indeed to retrieve that public confidence. Why I think all of this matters is because it severely limits the scope to make policy not just on asylum seekers, not just on unauthorised boat arrivals, but on migration more widely. The narrative goes, I think, something like this. If you, the government, can't be trusted to control the boats, then why on earth would I trust you to increase the intake of temporary migrants? Why on earth would I trust you to make sure that skilled migrants are not competing with nationals and natives in the labour market? Why on earth would I allow you and permit you to take forward-looking policy decisions, for example, around environmental migrants, environmental refugees, if you want to use that label in the relatively near future? So my second message this lunchtime to you is that I think there is a problem. It's not just a problem of numbers, and it needs to be fixed, and I think it needs to be fixed as a priority. So let's have a look at what the government is doing and has been doing to try to fix this issue. Now, I don't want to underestimate the range of policies the government has adopted. Some of them controversial, I think some of them quite ambitious, some of them quite sensible. But what I'd like to do simply, because of the time limitations, but I'll certainly come back and discuss bridging visas and various other controversial policies if you wish, is just spend a few minutes focusing on the so-called Malaysia Deal. Because it does seem to me that the Malaysia Deal was the central plank, the central pillar of the policy response that we got from the government during 2011 to this issue around boat arrivals. And despite the High Court ruling, it's quite clear to me, and I've been informed by many people about this, that the Minister of Immigration is still quite wedded to this solution. I don't think the solution is necessarily dead, and I think certainly certain people in Canberra are hoping it can be in some way revived. I think that's a mistake. I would characterise the Malaysia Deal as a high-cost, low-benefit policy. High-cost, low-benefit policy. And let me just explain what I mean by that. Firstly, high cost. This was a policy that was bound to be controversial. The notion of trying to somehow swap asylum seekers for resettled refugees. The notion of somehow trying to put some sort of value to it, 800 equals whatever the number was being resettled from Malaysia. This was bound to be a controversial issue. To try to valorise, to try to commoditise refugees and asylum seekers was inevitably going to be controversial. I can't believe the government didn't realise the controversy that would surround this particular policy and the thinking behind the policy. Secondly, this was bound to antagonise human rights activists. And by the way, not just in Australia, but in Malaysia too. It was inevitable that was going to happen, that the government must have understood that this was going to happen. This was a controversial deal from the beginning. Thirdly, an enormous amount of political capital must have been expended to get UNHCR on board. And I've had insights into that process from the Geneva perspective and various insights too from the Australia side, but certainly a lot of work, with a lot of political capital expended to try to involve UNHCR and have UNHCR's effectively blessing to make sure that this deal was legitimate and legitimised by the international community. And a fourth reason I think I would describe it as a high cost policy or policy proposal was it was inevitably going to attract increasing international attention. When this policy was proposed, it made the headlines in the UK. And of course, there were echoes here of the so-called Pacific solution, and there were echoes of the criticism that came with that solution, that here was Australia, a country that trades on its humanitarian reputation, now doing something that seems to trespass on humanitarian principles. All of this must have been clear to the people making this proposal, a very high-cost proposal to make. What makes this more astounding to me was that it was a high-cost proposal with potentially a very low benefit indeed. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Malaysia deal would have worked or will work. There is no comparable policy ever undertaken anywhere in the world that looks like the Malaysia deal. This was not evidence-based policy making, this was a Hail Mary. Nothing more than that. There is no evidence, there is no data to suggest that this solution in any way would have actually had its impact, and I think that's a very important point that I'd like to make. It seems to me in particular there are two fundamental assumptions that lay behind the policy that I think are questionable at best. One assumption is that this proposal, this policy would have deterred smugglers, and we know that Julia Gillard has been very active in the notion of smashing the business model and making sure that we focus on smugglers, and I think, by the way, that she's quite right to maintain that focus. Would the Malaysia deal really have deterred smugglers? Well, some previous research that I've done, and I've published with Lowy and spoken at Lowy about this, suggests to me that it really depends on the business model and the payment method that smugglers use in order to move people to Australia. If, as a smuggler, you are only paid once your client has reached the safety of the shores of Australia, then for sure this would have worked. Because this would have been a way of deterring smugglers. They wouldn't have been paid because they wouldn't have been able to guarantee that they could have delivered success for their clients. If, on the other hand, as is often the case, and it's certainly important not to generalise about smuggling, if, on the other hand, a smuggler receives most of his, and I use his advisedly, most of his money up front, then arguably from an economic or financial perspective, he doesn't have much incentive really whether or not the process works. He's got his money, he sends a person out on a boat, and what happens to that person really doesn't particularly matter, whether it's Christmas Island, whether it's the mainland, whether it's Malaysia. And it does seem to me that the Minister of Immigration can't have it both ways. On the one hand, he tells us that smugglers are evil, they're vicious, they're criminals, and they must be stopped. On the other hand, for this model of his to work, we have to assume that somehow smugglers are scrupulous enough that they'll only take the payment once the service has been delivered. And I can't see how you can marry those two assumptions. On the one hand, they're evil. On the other hand, they're very generous in their business model and the way that applies to asylum seekers. I don't think it fits. That assumption is critical for the Malaysia deal. It has to deter smugglers, and I don't think it does if the smugglers are paid up front, as certainly some of them are. The second great assumption, and there's quite a lot of work around this, is that asylum seekers would find out about the implications of trying to come to Australia. In other words, that they might end up being relocated and processed in Malaysia. The idea here is that even if a smuggler lies to you, you have the information to make a choice about your destination and perhaps to choose to work with another smuggler, maybe taking you to another part of the world. Do asylum seekers know about policies in the places to which they're going? There's a huge range of literature, and we just don't know what the conclusion is. But let me tell you this. I have worked fairly extensively on asylum and on refugees around the world. I have at least passing knowledge and interest in what's going on in Australia, and I have found it quite difficult to keep up with the policy changes in Australia this year. And I'm not living in a refugee camp in Pakistan, and I have 24-hour access to my BlackBerry and my iPhone and the internet and so on and so forth. Let's not assume that asylum seekers understand and know the intricacies of the policies that we think are smart as we introduce them. Even if asylum seekers have access to the information, and I wrote a short article again for Lowy on the YouTube adverts that were used rather prematurely, as it turns out, on the Malaysia deal, even if asylum seekers have access to the information, don't assume they trust it. Asylum seekers are people who are fleeing political persecution often. They are people who have been programmed not to trust governments. Why on earth would they trust the Australian government? They know that all the Australian government wants to do is keep them out. So we're not sure whether asylum seekers have access to the information, and if they do, we're not sure whether they trust it. And again, it seems to me the Malaysia deal relied on the assumption that asylum seekers would get the information, would understand what they were heading for, and then would make some sort of rational decision on the basis of that. And as a final assumption, I guess, let's not also forget that for some asylum seekers, they just don't care. If your alternative is to stay in Afghanistan and be slaughtered in sectarian killing, then frankly, whether you end up on the mainland of Australia or Christmas Island or Malaysia is probably not particularly relevant to you. What you want to do is get out of harm's way and get to safety. So there's a series of assumptions, it seems to me, that underline the Malaysia deal that make it, for me, very high cost, and I've spoken about the costs, and potentially very low benefit indeed. So my third message to you at this lunchtime is I think it would be a very serious mistake indeed for the Australian government to pin its hopes on the Malaysia deal. Let me move to my sort of final session and final message. What I'd like to do is to lay out very briefly, and of course I'm happy to come back and discuss these in detail during the Q&A, what I see as 10 steps or 10 proposals for a more robust, more effective, and I think more realistic policy that might be adopted by the Australian government. Again, don't forget how I started. This cannot be an insurmountable problem. It is inconceivable in an advanced society like Australia, with a hugely advanced migration managed system, with a massive amount of resources, can't respond to a relatively small issue. And it's quite striking that there seems to be this political vacuum and there's this sort of lack of thinking about where to go next. I'll try to learn one or two lessons from the European Union. You may well ask, what on earth has the European Union got to teach us? 250,000 asylum seekers arriving there each year, and that's a fair point. But don't forget that in the mid-1990s, it was 1 million asylum seekers a year. So the European Union got something right in reducing numbers fairly significantly over the last 10 or 20 years. Here's what I think are some ideas, some proposals, and certainly as an alternative to pinning all of our hopes on the Malaysia deal. Firstly, I think it behoves the government, particularly since the government, in my opinion, rightly has stressed that this is a humanitarian issue, it behoves the government to allow itself access to the full range of policy options. The notion that certain policies are off the table because they have a particular political affiliation, because they're associated with the previous government, seems to me to be unacceptable. If it turns out that Nauru is the most effective policy, let's go with Nauru. Let's at least have a serious discussion about the entire range of policies rather than using party politics to try to discount certain policies. I think that's a very important message. To combat asylum, to combat smuggling, to make sure this is done in a humane way, you need the full range of tools available, and you shouldn't limit your access to those tools. And I think that's an important message I'd like to get over to you. Secondly, I think the government is right to and should continue to pursue some form of regional processing. I think there has to be a regional processing solution to this. In particular, I think there has to be a way to make sure that there's not an automatic relationship between arriving on Christmas Island and getting to the mainland. There has to be some way that people who arrive on Christmas Island can be processed in a legal, humane, dignified way, preferably overseen by the UNHCR, but not on the Australian mainland. And I think regional processing in this particular context is a sensible thing for the government to pursue. Thirdly, and I won't spend much time on this, but again, happy to come back and discuss it with you, this backlog of asylum applicants and asylum seekers, especially those in detention centres on the mainland, but also the 1,300 or so that we know about on Christmas Island, has to be solved. It's inconceivable, and it's very surprising to me that it's not being solved. I remember speaking to Lynn Homer, who used to be the head of the UK border agency, and she went to see Tony Blair when he was still Prime Minister, and the UK was undergoing a very serious crisis about a huge backlog of asylum seekers and asylum dealing with their applications. And Blair said to Homer, "How long is this going to take?" And she said, "It'll take about a year." And he said to her, "How about 3 months?" Thank you. If there's the political will, it can be done. These are relatively small numbers of people. Get the processing system working. No asylum system, in my opinion, anywhere in the world is legitimate if you don't have a through flow. And I think the Australian government has to work on that through flow quickly. It can be done. It's a political reality. A fourth idea or proposal, I think there may be a case for reviewing or revisiting the national asylum procedures in Australia. It is very striking, and I know there's an ethnic dimension to this, but it's very striking, for example, that a very significant proportion of Afghan asylum seekers who arrive in Europe do not receive refugee status, and yet a very significant proportion of Afghans who arrive in Australia do. And certainly discussions I've had with various people, including at DIAC, suggest that it may well be that the Australian system is more flexible. I will try to not use the word more generous, but certainly more flexible and perhaps a little bit more open than other systems around the world. I don't think it's inappropriate, as long as you are operating within the minimum standards of the United Nations and international law, to review and revisit some of the national policy procedures that take place around asylum. I think that's a recommendation that I would make, with reservations, but a recommendation that I would make. Number 5, and again another lesson that we've learned in Europe, huge controversy around this policy, but it's certainly been effective. This is the so-called non-suspensive appeals policy that most European states now use. What this policy says is that for asylum seekers from listed countries, once you've made your asylum application and been rejected, you do not have the right to stay on the territory of the state while awaiting the outcome of your appeal. Now, the controversy is which countries you put on the list for NSA. We can accept Germany and Denmark, but perhaps putting Sri Lanka on, as the UK has recently, is a bit more dubious. But it's been a very effective way to try to make people understand that this is effectively a one-shot. If you're rejected, you don't then get another 3 years in the system to appeal and go through the High Court and eventually end up on the minister's desk. You will have to go back to your home country and wait the outcome of the appeal while you're in their country. It's a policy that's worked. It's hugely controversial, but I think it would be worth at least thinking about and looking at in this particular context. Number 6, Australia needs to accept that deportation is coming and that deportation is a very difficult policy indeed to achieve. As I've said, for me, a robust asylum system is an asylum system that moves people through the system, that gives them a fair crack at the process, and where they have clearly not achieved the grounds that are required as a refugee or some other form of temporary protection or enhanced status, then I think deportation has to take place. The lessons from Europe are, firstly, that deportation is expensive, very expensive indeed, 50, 60, 70,000 pounds to move one person out of the country and get them back to Afghanistan or Sri Lanka. And secondly, it very strongly depends on strong bilateral relations with the country of origin to which you're sending people back. The policy of deportation shouldn't be underestimated as a challenge. It's a very important challenge indeed. It does seem to me that Australia perhaps has one advantage in this realm over many European countries, which is that the trade-offs perhaps are fewer. By which I mean the real concern for the British government in deporting someone to South Asia is that there will be race riots in northern English cities because of the accusation of discrimination and racism against that person. The entrenched, embedded, very large ethnic communities that we have in the UK mean that sometimes it's a government trade-off. Which is better, to send home a rejected asylum seeker or to avoid a race riot in northern England? I suspect probably let's avoid the race riot and accept the fact we have a few rejected asylum seekers. As an aside, and one of the most innovative and remarkable policies I've come across recently, the Netherlands is now dealing with this. The same challenge: how do you come up with the money? How do you make deportation work? It's a very difficult thing to do. What the Netherlands is now doing is, once you've failed your application, once you've failed your 2 appeals, they're giving you a work visa to work. Which begs the question, why not let them in the first place? As labour migrants, of course, but this is how the Netherlands are trying to come to terms with it. My point is, I think Australia needs to think about deportation, and it should be part of this overall comprehensive approach. Number 7, I think Australia needs to adopt a much more comprehensive approach to smuggling. As I've said, I think that Chris Bowen and Julia Gillard are quite right to target smugglers. I think perhaps they have misunderstood the business model, but clearly smuggling lies at the heart of this. But it seems to me that to combat smuggling takes a truly comprehensive approach. You need to penalise smugglers, and I think Australia's got that right. I think you need to be pretty muscular on corruption in the origin and the transit countries. I know Pakistan well. I've done quite a lot of research in Pakistan. It is inconceivable that smuggling out of Pakistan is not taking place with the knowledge of, and sometimes with the consent of, the authorities in Pakistan. Now, I'm not talking about the Prime Minister, but certainly local customs officials, local police, so on and so forth. And I think there's an onus for the Australian government to start getting tough, to start using its power in this region with some of the authorities in transit and origin countries too. We need to look at the role of remittances. How do these poor Hazara find the $10,000 it requires to get them from Iran via Indonesia, eventually to Christmas Island or even Australia? Remittances, the role of diaspora, politically very sensitive issues, but again, we need to look at it, I think, if we're looking at a comprehensive response to smuggling. And information campaigns are important. I've written on information campaigns, I've spoken to you about access and trust, but they're certainly part of the picture. So it seems to me we're right to focus on smuggling, but we need a much wider, much more comprehensive approach to that particular challenge. And by the way, all of this comes with a price tag. Let's not forget that. 4,000 people, and the bill is adding up as I go through my list of points, and I think there's a balance we need to think about that. 3 final points, if I may, in this menu of 10 proposals. One is, I think it would be perfectly reasonable for Australia to target development assistance on the main countries of origin for asylum seekers in this country. That's in the national interest. I think it's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, and it gets towards this idea of addressing root causes. The only way to stop smuggling, the only way to stop asylum seeking is to allow people to live in dignity in their home countries. Now, of course, this is a long-term goal, and policymakers work with short-term levers in our democratic cycles, but targeting development aid to link with asylum policy is certainly something that Europe has done, and I think Australia could certainly do it in a more explicit way were it to choose to do that. My 2 final points, they sound like throwaway points, but they're not. For me, these 2 points are fairly fundamental to the entire process. Number 9 is to consult. I don't think any of this will work. I don't think the Malaysia Deal will work. I don't think any particular policy proposals in such a sensitive, politically charged area will work without detailed consultation. Consultation with migrants' organisations, consultation with refugee organisations, consultation with civil society. Trying to bring back these diverse groups on board, I think, is a very important effort that needs to be undertaken to move away from this rather divisive field that I see at the moment in Australia. And my 10th recommendation would be to publicise this, to make sure that the public is aware that we are adopting a truly comprehensive approach. We recognise this as a challenge, we understand why it's a challenge, we understand that we can't rely on a single solution, and instead we're looking at a whole range of solutions to try to address this whole, this panoply of different challenges that arise. So my final message to you at this lunchtime, I think Australia should adopt a comprehensive approach. I think it should use tried and tested policies rather than trying to invent new policies. And critically, it of course has to adopt policies that respect its international obligations to law and that respect the human rights of the people involved. So, Michael, let me summarise just by recapping my 4 messages this lunchtime. Firstly, I don't think Australia is facing an asylum crisis, and I certainly don't think that your current challenges are insurmountable. Secondly, there is a problem. It's not just a problem of numbers, and it needs to be addressed, I think, as a priority. Thirdly, I think it would be a mistake to pin all of our hopes on the Malaysia Deal, or indeed on any single response to what is clearly a multifold challenge. And finally, a comprehensive approach that relies on tried and tested policies and that respects international obligations and human rights. Thank you very much.